watching Reason and Theology Live. The show concentrates on theological topics, historical matters, and philosophical problems with content ranging from introductory material to in-depth examinations. And now, your host, Michael Lofton.
Hey everybody, welcome back on a Monday evening. As promised, we are back for our second show of the day with Dr. Matthew Minard, returning guest, who is going to be offering us a presentation on the common good and political philosophy, which is going to be, in my opinion, very timely, since I think it relates to quite a few things that are going on in the news. So, Dr. Minard, how are you? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing really well, but you bring up the very reason that my pastor this evening sort of grimaced when I told him. I said, I got to do this thing on political philosophy and the common good. And he sort of was like, oh, good luck with that. Have fun.
Right.
It was not what he wanted to do. So,
right.
But it's an important topic. And it's actually a topic that also, like, in the Catholic world has a kind of weird third rail, as I'll discuss a little bit, because there was a big scholastic dispute back in the 50s over it. But I hope you've been well. It's been a long time.
Yeah, it has been a little while. It seems like maybe a month or so.
Yeah.
And I'm happy you're here for this. I'm also looking forward to your contribution for the conference on June 11th, the RNT Catholic and Orthodox Conference that is going to explore what still divides us and what can we do to work towards unity between Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. So I look forward to your contribution for that.
Yeah, I look forward to a bit of, it's in some ways kind of like orderly personal meandering. But I feel like, it's like off to the races to start meandering through my thoughts again, though. We were on vacation, got COVID, it made things longer. And like now I hit the day with my lists, but I look forward to it. I think that'll be it's going to be a great topic. I think it'd be great, the discussion too.
Because that's also June 11th, probably in the evening around 6 p.m. That time may change, but around that time we're going to have a live Q&A with some of the contributors, including yourself. And I know Father Alexis has confirmed so far, and I imagine a few others will be able to make it as well. The downside is I won't be able to have everyone on at the same time. I can only have 6 people total, with myself being one. So only be able to have 5 of the contributors, but I think that's plenty.
That's a lot of people. I mean,
that's a lot of
anything substantive.
So exactly.
I see these kind of events. People get tired of them sometimes. They think, why in the world are we getting together to talk? I think of it as modeling the possibility of good behavior. Right? Because you have to be able to model with a sufficient amount of content, though. So it's not like, of course, empty, just good behavior, sitting together and having good manners.
Right.
But able to talk about some of the tough issues without losing your mind. And it's such a nice and necessary thing ecumenically, in contrast to what the internet usually, gives rise to. So kudos to you for avoiding the Twitter pull you down to the lowest common denominator.
No, I made sure to select everyone that I know would be charitable and productive for this conversation. People that would, discuss the issues that need to be discussed, but then that would do so in a charitable and profitable way, which is my desire. I really do want to see more unity with the Eastern Orthodox, and the only way that we're going to be able to really do that is to get past the polemics. It's necessary to address some of these issues, certainly, but
exactly. But in the spirit of the jargon of today,
right,
you have to encounter each other.
Accompany with. Journey with.
I don't usually use this.
I don't like those terms either, but I occasionally have to use them myself. So
I know it's born of Rome, but it's kind of born of bishops' conferences kind of stuff.
Yeah.
All right. Well, on that note, why don't we we can go ahead and do a little bit of lecturing, and then I guess we'll do questions for whoever happens to be floating around.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds good.
Yeah. So take it away.
All right. Thank you, sir. Well, good evening or hello, good morning, whenever you happen to be watching this, everybody. I'm Dr. Matthew Minard. The listeners and watchers of Reason and Theology will know me rather well from my various lectures, but I feel like this strange introduction is necessary. It's strange in the sense that I've become so comfortable with the folks, the regular viewers at Reason and Theology. But this is a talk that's a little bit out on the side. It's not in the vein of some of the commentary on St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae that I've been in the midst of doing, or some related things in kind of Catholic intellectual history. I threw the idea to Michael because we're eventually going to meet about a book on conscience that I had come out, and I said, I'm teaching a political philosophy class this summer. Maybe we should have something on the common good. I wish I had a little bit more time here, prep-wise, to be able to pull together from a course that I'm actually in the midst of offering online right now, appropriate slides for this venue. But I was away on vacation, lost a couple days because we had to delay our return back to home because of COVID. So I'm gonna go in straight form lecture the way that I've done for so many of the Summa lectures on St. Thomas. But for the sake of clarity, so you have an idea of where we're going, I'm going to begin by sort of defining terms concerning the notion of the common good, politically speaking, because there really are many kinds of common goods, by using precisely the political tradition that's really most comfortable talking in terms of the common good, namely the Aristotelian tradition. So in a sense, that's going to be the received vocabulary of what I do think is probably the most powerful grammar of trying to think of political thought precisely as political, precisely as something common and shared as an endeavor undertaken by a given group for the sake of human flourishing, recognizing freedom, etc., but for the sake of human flourishing, and not merely for the sake of guaranteeing individual rights maximally. So we'll talk about that first. We'll use Aristotle's sort of very high level of the politics, and then a couple of themes as well that arise in the Latin West most profoundly. The Byzantine East has sort of a different experience of the empire that's different than the throne and altar distinctions that the West has. But the West really influenced modern politics because of some reactions to that. Having set that up, we're going to then do a second step, which is effectively to consider modern philosophy, political philosophy, under a slightly, but not undeservedly, simplifying rubric. We're going to consider, just as there's epistemological modernity, there's also political modernity. And one of the great issues of modern political thought is a sort of loss of the notion of a common good, or at least a minimalization of that. And we'll talk about this theme of how various shades of what we're going to call liberalism, and we're just going to use that term to stand not for, of course, merely liberal thought in a particular instantiation in political parties here in the United States or in Europe, but rather to stand for an outlook of political philosophical logic, we might say, that places the protection of individual rights and individual freedom at the center of its political project. It's a political project that views really the only common good to be that task. And everything else in the anthropology in question, or at least a lot of the anthropology, is made up of autonomous free individuals who decide what their own destiny should be, what their substantive goods of human flourishing should be. And of course, we'll make room for some of the insights of liberal thought, but liberal thought has been deeply problematic and has been critiqued. And those who are sort of into the literature will feel echoes, in particular of Patrick Deneen, professor at Notre Dame, that influences my critique of liberal modernity. But we're just going to consider some themes to get an idea of how we, especially in America, we're pretty heavily liberal in our outlook. Now, technically, American history is a little bit more complex than that. We have a lot of republicanism as well, but we tend to think in terms of either progressive liberalism, especially from the late 19th century onward, or kind of strange conservative liberalism, protecting individual rights. And of course, the fusionist conservatism of the anti-Soviet era. is sort of a good touch point for seeing that as part of the American conservative outlook. Well, once we move through that, I'll then just address a couple things contemporary. Most of them are going to have a Catholic valence. A couple different topics about the common good that have been popular in Catholic discussions. They're not unrelated to other projects that are floating around out there concerning post-liberalism. And while I'm not looking to stake my actual position among any camp, because truth be told, I don't quite feel comfortable with any camp, I just want to provide at least a little bit more illumination as much as you can in a little evening lecture like this concerning kind of contemporary discussions and even some discussions in the mid 20th century that are important to understand because they're being talked about again. Okay, let's begin now. Common good. So it's very tempting when someone hears the common good to think of something like, Scrooge in Dickens's Christmas Carol, the common weal. There's a sense in which the expression common good is used very often to mean something like the individual goods that we have all together. So something that belongs to the common good would be roads that we each benefit from, or education that we benefit from as individuals, or even property rights, property protection that we have as citizens. We could come up with all sorts of things here. We could put social safety net programs in here, etc. We tend to think of the common good as a kind of aggregate of conditions for us to flourish, kind of a grouping of all the possible goods that we as individuals could have, but we share them in some sort of way in common in the society because the society helps to provide these sorts of public goods. But really, it's important, and it's very important to remember what I'm about to say as we talk about this, because when I talk about the common good, there really are multiple common goods all around us. There are all sorts of activities that we do in which the good of the group is the good of each individual who's doing their part in the group, but they're doing a kind of activity that cannot be done in isolation. An example of this, the best theorist on this topic, by the way, is the French Catholic philosopher Yves Simone. Yves Simone, his general theory of authority, or also his philosophy of democratic governance, are very good and clear on this topic. But an example that's often used, and I do think it's of use, because it helps us to contrast private goods or individual goods and a common good, is something like a symphony. Whenever we think of a symphony getting together to practice a piece of music, we don't merely think that there are a group of people, of course, just playing whatever on the stage. That's obvious. But we also don't think of the symphony, if it's a symphony, as being, a whole bunch of people who happen to show up at exactly the same time so that they could start playing their instruments all at the same moment and individually play parts by themselves, right? They're playing their parts sorry, I got a message that distracted me. They're playing their parts precisely as members of a given group, playing this or that piece of a repertoire. I'm going to have to turn that sound off. This or that piece of the repertoire and interpreting it in this kind of way. And the only way that the individual members of the symphony can actually be sorry, I get these endless messages that happen to be popping in. The only way that we can talk about the symphony's activity, the members of the symphony's activity, is precisely as parts of that whole. That each person, we can point to them and say, well, what are they doing? They're playing, I don't know, a cantata by Bach or the Kindertotenlieder of Gustav Mahler or whatever. And we can go through each and every person and say, that person is playing, yes, just a part, but they really are playing that piece of shared music. There's a good that is shared among all of them that is present in each of the people there. Another example of a kind of common good, and especially we see this whenever we get involved in the discussion after these lectures, there's a way in which knowledge functions as a common good insofar as we can all contemplate the same truths. And they don't diminish. We share them together. mean, that's the real beauty of knowledge comes above all whenever you realize that the truth that you know is a truth that you share together with others. This comes to the foreground most clearly, like I said, in discussions, because in a discussion, you have a sense in which you and other people are kind of trying to find the truth, and you're doing it together, but you're doing the same thing, even though you're sort of working at it together. Okay, these are common goods, not necessarily political at all, but they at least give us an idea of shared activities. Of course, other things could then be analogized to this. And we have all sorts of societies that exist in relationship to each other, next to each other, and nested around each other, where groups of people have particular activities which they would not perform just by themselves. The clearest case of this, there's a reason why even Aristotle begins the Politics talking about this topic, is the family. The natural family, considered as a procreative and, we might say, family rearing unit, not merely raising children from infancy till they can leave the house, but really keeping the bonds of generations in relationship with each other and handing on the goods of a particular subdivision of humanity situated in this particular place, and doing that over the course of the years, sort of telling each generation the story of humanity. That kind of activity is a shared activity of a household and also a broader family group. And so the family in that activity, which has lots of rich variance from culture to culture, etc., is doing something that could only be done, that really only should be done by those who are united by certain blood bonds. And of course, it's up to the philosophy and also the sociology of economics, if you will, the study of the household, to then figure out the details of that. But there are various other small communities, be it small municipalities, be it county-wide governments, be it small groups in a city that get together to address problems of homelessness or hunger, or maintaining the roads if you live in a rural area, co-ops for selling food, etc. Each of these are little societies that are united in their activity by shared ends. And that sharing of the end is to have a common good. And all of these goods kind of relate to each other, and they eventually get to a level where you have not merely sovereignty, but you have a wholeness of community. And for the Aristotelian tradition, that kind of whole community in which the provision of all things that are necessary for human flourishing, or we should say the context for human flourishing, is possible, where we can, live the life of not merely family members, not merely just individuals looking for their own good, not merely just in our local community, but doing the most that you can do in the task of justice together. That is the political community, and that's the political good. Now, of course, with some wisdom, this was thought of on the model of the Greek city-state. There's a certain limit to the size this community can become. Now, where that fits for our contemporary discussion is a much different thing, because the size of our governmental units causes all kinds of problems regarding the common good. Usually, the bigger your group becomes, the less you share as regards the end. But if you imagine a group of people who generally share the same ideal of what it is to be human, broadly speaking, a certain Athenian or a certain Spartan or etc. view of virtue, these people living together try to create the conditions of society for human flourishing, part of which would be just negotiating the activity of political authority, so that our shared activity can aim toward, in various ways, at least having the context for developing a virtuous and full human character. And so, just to use an example here that's more contemporary, the old blue laws or anti-pornography laws, or laws promoting certain things as regards education, certain things that should be in a curriculum. These are actually very legitimate questions. We Americans, especially about the last one, we get nervous because our federal government really shouldn't be handling education. But politically some group must address, well, how do we hand on as a group of multiple families the knowledge of past generations? So creating the conditions for that sort of living is the task of politics, is trying to, in some of the scholastic jargon, materially figure out the exacts of what the common good is in this particular community. And when that community is centered on the wholeness of life, that's a political community. Aristotle would bequeath to the Latin West, and it's a Greek, it comes out of a Greek context, but it's going to end up living in the Latin West eventually, whenever Aristotle is found again in the 12th century. But in the politics, he arranges regimes in a way that takes on its own life and kind of gets used even whenever it's changed by later authors, namely this famous sixfold division of regimes. It's very often thought of as being on two columns. Here I'll admit that there's something I received in graduate school from Monsignor Sokolowski. So as I kind of make some moves here, I'm definitely drawing from a course I had with him, actually. Robert Sokolowski sort of may not be known for his thought on politics, but he's actually far more than just a phenomenologist. And in particular, his courses on Hobbes and Aristotle's politics were quite synthetically good. So Aristotle has basically three regimes that are bad. We'll start there, where the ruler or the ruling faction is not concerned with constituting a just order for the common good of all so that all may flourish, but rather with a kind of, partisan politic for their particular group or even their particular individual. And so these would famously be a tyranny, an oligarchy, and actually a democracy. So let's start with tyranny. It's the easiest. We think of a tyrannizing king or perhaps a king's family that basically has, taken over by some way or other a given state or a given political community and has made everything, to the degree that this is possible, function for the aggrandizement of their family. That's a kind of tyranny. An oligarchy, see, Aristotle says that you will always have both the rich and the poor. And the rich is made up of a sort of fake aristocracy, or at least a kind of substitute for an aristocracy, where a given group, but small, most often wealthy, looks to influence politics, and indeed does, for the sake of its own enrichment or its own power, etc. No doubt you should feel, as Americans, those of you who are Americans listening, but many in the West, that this is an element that is active in our own political discourse. Part of the fight of politics is to try to drive this stuff out. And then a democracy would be, seems strange to us, but the idea would be, think of group politics, where particular factions and groups of individuals fight for their groups to have, certain rights. Now, this might be legitimate in certain cases. That's not the purpose of tonight's lecture. But where people start to think of all of politics as, I need to maximize what's good for my group, that is a democratic in negative sense in Aristotle's view, because the logic is individual, it's not common. Or it's not, even if it's not individual, it's worried not about the wholeness of the community, but rather about a particular subgroup. Now, for Aristotle, there's the other side. And a monarchy is maybe the easiest to see. It's the rule of one for the sake of the common good. But I actually want to jump down to the bottom parallel here. Is something he refers to as a politeia. There's not really a name for it. Some people call it a republic, but that's a Roman term. But let's call it a republic nonetheless, and realize that we're applying something from the Roman world, Ciceronian world. That's not quite Aristotle. But he thinks of a kind of, in his case, because he's a Greek of a certain era, a broadly based, generally financially free, often well trained through the military class of people who, they've had military service, that they're disciplined, that serve in the political community day in and day out as appropriate, sometimes ruling, sometimes being ruled, but for the sake of the common good of the political community, to try to solve problems of shared concern for the community that has a certain view about human flourishing. And an aristocracy would just be a smaller version of this, where a small group of those who truly are excellent and virtuous would do this same sort of ruling for the sake of the common good. And a monarchy is just one person. Aristotle says that in the end, he prefers a monarchy or an aristocracy, it seems, but he sees that the most realistic to try to achieve is the politeia, the republic. Later on, our own constitutional order tries to combine some of these elements, the idea of a mixed constitution of various of these three regimes. Now, okay, so we've presented them as two columns, that we've got three on the side of the common good: a monarchy, an aristocracy, and a republic. And then we have a tyranny, an oligarchy, and a democracy in that sort of mob rule sense that we mentioned. But the better way to think of it is Monsignor Sokolowski sort of had the two, monarchy and aristocracy, sort of floating up at the top as ideal regimes, but the best on a sort of triangle, the best that's more likely to happen is the republic. But always within the republic, there's a kind of pulling, because rarely are aristocrats just aristocrats. They become oligarchs, or then the masses become more democratic in the negative sense. And so there's a kind of pull toward the many, or the few who look to serve themselves. And part of what the task of politics is sort of like trying to pull up and pull those factions closer so that their interest is oriented toward the common good. But what they're actually pulling toward is not merely themselves sort of, I don't know, winning some contest, but they're pulling down toward tyranny. That tyranny is usually born of those regimes, the oligarchy and democracy kind of pulling apart. There are many ways in which we have pulled ourselves down quite a bit in both an oligarchic and democratic fashion in America. Those elements are quite operative in our view of the common good, because we tend to think of the common good as getting something for my group. And it just seems to be common as a kind of collection of goods for my individual group. Well, okay, so this is very basic, but it gives you an idea of what the common good is. This is the sort of thing I joke with my students sometimes. It makes me want to have a stiff bourbon, because I know how much I'm simplifying the next step. One of the things that of course the Latin Christian Middle Ages raised is the issue of multiple common goods. Now, one thing to bear in mind with what we said is the idea of society is actually really a kind of nesting of goods and their relationships institutionally to each other. And there are relationships of justice between family and local community and various local communities, and then larger local communities, and then eventually the political community. All of these various communities with their rights and also too their duties in relationship to each other. Balancing those out is the nature of social justice. It's a particular exercise, for those of you who know the jargon, of legal justice and distributive justice, part whole and whole part relations. And in a sense, there's a bit of commutation as well, really. But the playing out among groups in society is what social justice actually is. The current usage of the term social justice is quite bastardized from its original sense, which it took from Luigi Tapparelli, actually, the Jesuit theorist of politics in the 19th century, who was of influence, as well as Liberatore, I forget his first name, but Liberatore as well, on Pius the Leo the 13th, on Leo the 13th. But notice there, and now this is where we're going to see the Christian thing that comes in. These are a question of various goods in relationship to each other. But of course, a Christian society is well aware, as Western Christendom was in its sort of various pieces and forms, that you can't ask the question of the common project that we have politically concerning what a flourishing human life is without asking yourself, of course, ultimately the religious question of what is the true faith and how does the church relate to the state. It's much bigger than what we can consider today, but what it is, or what this question represents, is the nesting of two different common goods: the political and temporal common good, and the ecclesiastical common good, the eschatological common good that is the life of the church. And so this relationship between church and state, as I'm sure many of you know, was a fraught affair in the Latin Middle Ages. And of course, in some ways, it still remains rather fraught in its articulation to this day. But how it is that the church has authority over the temporal order became, especially by the Baroque period, very important topic. Hobbes's own frontispiece, his picture of the Leviathan on the front of the book Leviathan, has something where he's making fun of Bellarmine for the idea of the papacy and also just the church more broadly. The church's indirect authority over political matters. Articulating that is very important because the church was quite clear. One finds this in the 15th century in someone like Juan de Torquemada, but it's present already at the time of Aquinas, that this authority is indirect. It's not, however, something that cancels the political community, politics as such, that there is an order of nature and there is an order of temporal community that is, for the, in some ways, it's really the vocation of the laity to really be involved in this, that is the task of politics. But politics cannot be totally indifferent to religion. And of course, that's a kind of different integralism question that we will, however, jump back to just a teeny bit at the end. However, the splitting of Christianity in the West created the conditions, along with economic growth and other factors as well, appreciation for humanism, even just the growth of technology and so forth, let alone the material conditions in particular kingdoms, created the development of the modern nation state. Now, we could get into a discussion of sovereignty as it comes from Jean Bodin, or some of the ideas of the state in Machiavelli, which would not be without use. But to hang your hat on a way of thinking about the common good in this environment is that the effect of the religious wars and religious difference led to a prizing of a kind of privacy regarding substantive questions of value. What do I mean by that? The wars of religion and just the general upheaval of the age led the political question to shift from being how do we work together to create the conditions for living the life of justice as a society so that we may flourish both naturally, but also as well in the order of grace in some way as humans, to how can I protect my rights to basically be free from tyranny, to not be tyrannized, to not be permitted to harm others, but not worry in politics about all those thorny issues that seem to give rise to interminable questions of religion, and very often questions of morality. Let us give up the shared task of trying to create the conditions for living the life of virtue, and let's rather guarantee a domain in which individuals can exercise their freedom with as few fetters as possible, but in a way that hopefully redounds to the general good of everybody. Now, this takes form in a couple different kind of classical texts. We could probably choose others. I just want to consider, though, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and then Jean-Jacques Rousseau, historically moving along. Thomas Hobbes is often known as being a kind of monarchist, his Leviathan. But if you remember, if you've ever seen the frontispiece, the front cover of the Leviathan, there's this image of the one power, the one monarchical power, kind of holding in his hands both the sword and the crozier. He has both church and state in hand, and he's made up of individuals. All these individuals are kind of making him up. Well, Hobbes postulates, unlike Aristotle, who thinks that man is because he is a rational animal, men and women are political by nature. Of course, for Aristotle, it's mostly men, but men and women are political by nature. Hobbes postulates that by nature we are apolitical, and we technically have a right to everything, and we're in a sense quite equal to each other, because we could ultimately kill each other pretty easily. And so this is the famous idea that, in the state of nature, without an overawing power, life is short and brutish, nasty. And what's necessary is for everybody to give up all their rights, so that then a constituted state, a Leviathan, can create the conditions for people to be able to live a kind of peaceable life, not harming each other, recognizing different communities as they are appropriate, but ultimately creating the conditions for not falling into, the wars like the wars of religion. Now, this is like I'm simplifying Hobbes endlessly here, but there's a very strong line in him. I believe, from what I recall, that this sort of interpretation is something that is indebted to Michael Oakeshott. But others, I'm sure, have seen this. Hobbes is a kind of first liberal, or is at least a kind of early liberal, insofar as the political project becomes, above all, creating the conditions for individuals to be able to flourish, kind of asserting their own view of the world, as long as they're not getting in others' way. Now, it's not quite articulated that way, but it's present there. Most famously, John Locke, writing against against monarchical tyranny and against claims of patriarchal monarchy that sort of would come down from even the time of perhaps Adam and justify the existence of inherited monarchy, someone like Filmer. He famously writes, of course, the two treatises, but we in America know of the second treatise on government, or second treatise of government. Poor Locke gets, I think, a kind of simplistic dismissal by certain critics of liberalism today. Locke is a liberal, but he's not quite the liberal that I think he sometimes made out to be. And also, too, Locke was not as influential on our constitutional order, especially, as some think. He was very influential at the time of the founding, but then, or the revolution, I should say. But as for our constitutional order, there's a lot of other stuff of English common law and Montesquieu and other things in our Constitution in America. But Locke famously kind of uses this idea of state of nature, though a slightly different way. And it's important always to bear this in mind. He notes that the state of nature, whenever there is no political community, it's not necessarily a state of war. It's not a state of war, which is what the king got himself into, like, for instance, in the case of the Glorious Revolution. But the king can put himself in a state of war with people. But the state of nature is just the pre-political state where we don't have an authority to adjudicate the particulars of the natural law of ethics, because we don't have a political magistrate to handle questions of justice. And so we have to create a society in which this is possible. And then this is, is this all of Locke? Is this American Locke? But the way Locke is usually read here in America especially is that we hand over to the government a certain number of, and this is very influenced by Thomas Paine, for example, we hand over certain limited scope rights to the government so that we have the room for the retention of our life, liberty, and all that is ours. This idea of property is really the fruits of our work, all the things I happen to set my mind to, that which is proper to me. We in our Declaration inherited this as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness as rights that cannot be alienated. But of course, there are exception cases to this when we think of the penal justice system. But that way of thinking about politics, especially framed in terms of rights negatively to be kept, while it is a way of preventing the tyranny of the government over individuals, which is kind of what Locke is concerned with, it does not articulate explicitly, although maybe implicitly there's a lot there, a shared notion of what it is to flourish, a shared notion of flourishing. So it has a kind of propensity, just as Hobbes does, to get rid of the idea of the common good of politics so as to replace it with creating the conditions for individuals to live their lives and not bother each other, and to make their decisions about what happens to be substantively important to them. But that's what politics is. So a very strong sense in which modern politics in some ways evacuates out some of the political problem itself, that it thinks of politics in an apolitical fashion. Now, more just to show you another way that this idea of the state of nature goes, Rousseau is the great yelling critic of the Enlightenment project, and he famously writes his two discourses where he basically proposes the idea that some know of it as the idea of the noble savage, that we are born in a kind of freedom by nature, and actually we are chained down and we lose our capacities precisely by becoming civilized. So there's a sense in which civilization and politics impedes us being our most authentic self. Of course, this is quite the opposite of the classical, and be it Aristotelian or then Roman. I mean, there's a whole list of Roman Stoic and Roman Ciceronian, sort of ideas about citizenship. We cannot be our fullest nature without being social and without being political and without sharing together the project of creating the conditions of a full community and all the various relationships of justice and laws, etc., that promote human flourishing. That's the classical view, and I think it's the most powerful set of principles for articulating the political issue, the political problem. But to turn that on its head, whenever one thinks of a primeval sort of goodness of our natural endowment as human, along the lines of what one finds in those discourses, especially by Rousseau, we find ourselves then also critiquing the very positive effects of society. Society deforms. It is not elevating for us. I just note that it's a different vein that's baked in to elements of the modern mind. And although, of course, not everyone is reading Rousseau, there's a sense in which great philosophers write the things that are in the logic of the air. And so the idea of looking for our most authentic self is deeply ingrained in liberal political thought. You see this in its own way with a kind of romantic flair in someone like John Stuart Mill in his essay on liberty, and which would function as actually a good fourth person to stick here in our listing. Now, of course, we could keep tracing this and how this idea of politics, then you can never be quite merely liberal libertarian, and how this takes various moves throughout the 19th century, down through the developments of like in America, progressivism and so forth, and then how this idea of liberalism is deeply connected actually to the rise of communism and socialism. In many ways, this individualism and the idea of negative rights just becomes positive rights also, the things that are needed to be provided by the government for the flourishing of individuals. It's still an individualism, because you're only thinking about creating the conditions for individuals to flourish, but it begins to take on valences which are socialistic. It's very interesting to see how the loss of the notion of the true common good tends toward at least the excesses of socialism, and it depends on then what you think about Marxism. And then you see totalitarianism is just a kind of individualism of the class that asserts itself. Usually, or kind of tyranny, I should say, by the class or group that asserts itself. But totalitarian regimes have a more problematic relationship with the common good because they do have a notion of the common good, and it created all kinds of, as we know, havoc in the 20th century. So much so that many fight for liberal values with complete strenuousness because they have such a fear of falling back into those totalitarian regimes. But that's perhaps something to take up in our questions. So we've presented a certain vein of at least strong impulse, even if it's not always present, in the modern period of being a reduction of the common good actually to the particular good or the individual good, or at least the non-universal group, and it's the subgroup. And kind of politics becomes a kind of individualism seeking its rights, or groups seeking their particular goods. Okay, so in the Catholic world, just a few remarks to situate us today without trying at all to be comprehensive here. One issue that's kind of up in the air that people are talking about quite a bit is the issue from the Middle Ages that was bequeathed concerning the relationship between the temporal common good and the spiritual common good, or we might say the temporal state common good and the common good of the church. This is the question raised regarding integralism. And it's quite interesting, but notice how it's not necessarily tied up with, the question of monarchism. There are various kinds of integralism that could be taken up, various kinds of articulations. And I would even argue that Catholic theologians actually have the duty to say that something like this is still held by the church, because Dignitatis Humanae, the somewhat controversial declaration on religious liberty at the Second Vatican Council, is clear at the beginning, even if it doesn't make clear how to do this, that the traditional teaching concerning the duty of the state to receive sufficiently proposed revelation has not been abrogated. There are some who argue that was just a non-definitive teaching, but it seems, if we read the text of Dignitatis Humanae, on human dignity, that the church still asserts this. And so the questions that are raised about integralism are, I think, important today. I wish that some of the groups, I feel there's a certain snideness in some of the discussion, or a kind of harshness. And I wish those questions could sort of be discussed more openly. In some ways, I feel more comfortable with it because I don't live in a day-to-day Roman Catholic world, and so I don't have the same institutional pressures, because the West had a kind of trauma concerning this topic because of the SSPX and Lefebvre, which we just hadn't inherited in the East. But now, there was a debate concerning the common good that's also quite important because people talk about it. And it occurred and I forget exactly the dates here because of the ordering of articles, but in the late 40s and then into the 50s, where the Laval philosopher, Charles de Connick, writes a book on the common good against the personalists. Now, of course, here I should make an aside that when de Connick and others talk about the primacy of the common good, they're above all concerned with, of course, the rights of God concerning or in relationship to man. Our duty to know and love God above all else is always kind of structurally built into the idea of justice, because we are always ordered to the common good that is God. That very often in this discussion comes up, but we're just not going to take that up in detail. It's a quintessentially Christian way of thinking about the common good, but it tends to get you up into the heavenly heights before trying to deal with the more mundane common goods of the political community. But he writes this book against a kind of broadly conceived, in his mind, individualist, personalist bent in Francophone thought, which was existing in the 40s and thereafter. And this book was seen and interpreted as being also an attack on Jacques Maritain. Now, first of all, Maritain is never cited in the book. De Koninck is said never to have read Maritain. He never seems to, he does not seem to, I should say, not never. It does not seem, to my knowledge, to have instigated a discussion of this with Maritain. He claimed that Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange was a personalist, which I find perplexing, although if anyone's interested in some of the reason for that, I guess I can bring it up. And so it was not clear to some of those who were close to Maritain whether or not this book was an actual attack on him. Yves Simone wrote for the Review of Politics a 5 or 6 page review in which he noted that De Koninck very well lays out, even if in a somewhat clunky fashion, what you can find on the primacy of the common good in human activity, both natural and supernatural, because our justice is above all communal justice, and our knowledge and love of God is above all a sharing in the shared common life of the blessed, which is the common life of the three persons of the Trinity. And he says that this is all presented well and fine, but as regards Maritain's position, it has nothing to do with it whatsoever. And I think that this is correct, to be honest. De Koninck, though, responds to certain criticisms, and some of which were intemperate, by, for example, Ignatius Eschmann. Father Eschmann wrote a defense of Maritain, which in some ways didn't do Maritain good, because it is a liberal, in the modern sense, a modern liberal argument, or classical modern, I mean, that does suffer from a loss of the idea of the common good somewhat. Maritain always stressed that the spiritual good, the spiritual common good, is greater than the political common good, and that's, I think what launched the disagreement among parties. But Father Eschmann's rebuttal then led, in part, I forget the exact now chronology here, to an article being written that was longer than the book by De Koninck. And so, if you ever hear people, and I think De Koninck did a fine job. I find the book a little bit tedious stylistically, but he's substantively in agreement with what I've even said about the common good here today, and I think substantively in agreement, at least with Yves Simone, if not Maritain. And Simone and Maritain were very close. I think that if you have a chance to read anything on political rationality and the common good, Simone is your person. Yves Simone is, anything he touches is gold and very clear, but his philosophy of democratic government and his general theory of authority in its last redaction, although there also is freedom and community, and there's one or two other books as well where he deals with political issues, which he's just very good on. And that's really what I think is just as much the important place to talk about the common good within Catholic political philosophy and Catholic political theology as well. Some of the inherited language of the common good that comes out of Gaudium et Spes from Vatican II is a little bit less than felicitously exact. It's just the nature of everything with Gaudium et Spes. It was a little bit more of a meandering document of his time. But Simone is a very clear expositor, and I would encourage you, if you happen to be on one side or the other of this whole so-called debate, that we should actually just bury the hatchet about it. I'll admit that because I was more influenced by Simone and Maritain, that I tend to defend them a little bit. So I find it a little bit tiresome when I think that they're maltreated by those who are more in the Laval line of De Koninck. But I'm willing to just bury the hatchet, but I'm not sure people are willing to concede that. Maritain is less the bête noire about these matters than people make him out to be. So that brings us to the last conversation, which is the idea of common good conservatism. And I'm only going to barely wade into these waters because I'm not a wonky or even a rank punditry, let alone a politically operative kind of person. I think that the folks who are raising these questions, I have certain hesitancies regarding Adrian Vermeule, maybe it's just because of the onlineness, the Twitterishness. But, people like Patrick Deneen or Chad Pecknold, even Sohrab Ahmari as well. I don't know. Once again, it's probably because of the style. I'm just a little bit not into the sort of confrontational style. Unless it's one-on-one, then I guess I can be confrontational, and maybe that's all it is. But especially Deneen and the more academic sort of conversations that are being had. I think it's important to ask ourselves at this moment where American conservatism is recognizing the fact that there's much more even in the conservative blood. I should have made a point about modern philosophy and all the people who were reacting to modernity, be it Burke or de Maistre, although he's got his issues, Donoso Cortez, heavens to Betsy, we could then start thinking about the various subgroups of American and British conservatism. You get the point, though. These are all very important questions because American conservatism has bought a very high amount of rhetoric from libertarianism. And I myself was a libertarian once upon a time when I was a young man. But that's a kind of individualism that doesn't take into account the common good sufficiently. But one of the weaknesses of the discussion somewhat is to talk about the common good as though it's like this thing. And it's better to think in terms of the exercise of the particular virtues of justice, various species of justice, trying to coordinate together social institutions for the sake of, very often people will talk about the good. Well, okay, what's meant by that? Because that's a little bit of a hazy expression. The creating of a society in which free human beings achieve a particular view of flourishing with sufficient latitude to recognize that, of course, there's all kinds of prudential room for living our lives and being virtuous, and yet recognizing as well that there's no such thing as a neutral state. There actually always is a common good, and there always is a certain view of who is the best citizen in a given regime. It could just be the jet-setting Silicon Valley type would be the person who is the most praised and honored by a regime. Maybe not, but the point being is there's a certain view of the human good that is built into the logic of any society. And raising the question of how to articulate this, to do so in a forthrightly honest way, with a rich vocabulary of the virtues, to find a way that can be somewhat in continuity with where we are, but move things forward toward a more robust moral vision of what it is to do politics together. And Patrick Deneen makes the point that we actually don't need a theory right now. We need the practice of doing this locally. This is all very good. And it's thought of as being common good conservatism, I believe, precisely because it moves away from some of the main lines of liberal thought, which thinks of the human person primarily along the lines of an autonomous, freely self-constituting individual, choosing in accord with their own options and preferences, and creating a society that enables the maximization of that sort of choosing for individual ends. So I can't believe it took an hour, but that's the meandering of what I wanted to say this evening on the common good, Michael. Maybe Michael. Oh, there you are. I was gonna say maybe you disappeared. You went to.
Sorry, I had to turn my speakers off there. That way we don't get feedback. I asked everybody to put some questions there in the chat, but I haven't seen any. But I did see Fire of God, Hebrew Israelites, was asking if we are taking questions. So yes, if you have one, go ahead and put it in there. I see some comments. Good lecture. But trying to find actual questions. Another comment, these are high quality lectures for free. Yes, indeed. Seminary level content for free. Trying to see.
Donate a little bit to Michael at R&T. He doesn't pay me to say that.
Right. Yeah, I don't. Oh,
But
here's one from James. What does Aquinas mean when he refers to God as the common good? And
yeah,
relatedly, how is the common good related to the love of God and neighbor?
no, this is great, James. This is a great question. I avoid this like as the beginning hermeneutic, not because I think it's wrong at all, because I think so many of the conversations. I remember this in graduate school even get bogged down, because of course Aquinas inherits, and it is somewhat Aristotelian and then Neoplatonic. He inherits the idea of technically everything has a sort of yearning for the good of the whole of the universe. And so a kind of love of above all God is actually written into all beings. Some beings do it in a way that's not knowing. They just imitate God in some very finite manner, and they're a material being. Or plants and animals do it in their own way. And then in the case of man, we have the added though ability to recognize, to not merely have our nature sort of unfold itself um, in the way that it does in lower creatures, but to take that in hand and to make our very acts internally by way of devotion and prayer and self-offering, and externally as well, a kind of offering to God as the first holder of rights in the universe. In other words, we have a kind of duty out of justice to love God with a religious love, even by nature. And then, of course, too, as Christians, we know that God becomes the very object of our love in his supernatural mystery through the virtue of charity. And we also affix ourselves to God in his redemptive omnipotence through the theological virtue of hope. And ultimately, the love of charity above all, but also too the firmness of hope, become the center of our moral universe, sort of spreading out over the rest of our relationships. It's quite clear how this takes place in the case of, for instance, fraternal charity, where we love others with the love of God by observing a kind of ordering of our particular love for them uh, to the divine love. We incorporate our love of neighbor into God's own vocational calling for us to love someone else with his own particularized love in these situations, with a kind of self-sacrifice, and then also too, though, sharing in spiritual goods with them, which is of course the most powerful kind of friendship that we would share in with fraternal charity. And in all of these we see a way in which the common good is the exercise of the highest of our particular potentialities as individuals. Doing the life of justice, which has to do with the common good just politically, is the fulfillment of the highest thing naturally we can do as humans. To build a community that recognizes not merely the rights of others and institutions, but above all the rights of God as our creator, and to live a kind of religious life. This is, in a sense, concerned with that which is common, is the common good of the whole universe. But the living of the religious life, the virtue of religion, is, of course, the fulfillment of human perfection, because we are capable of those sorts of acts. So you see how there's also this real danger, especially in the modern period, to think of the common good versus the particular good as though you sacrifice something to the state. But even in those hard cases of dying for the sake of a just war, it's actually, all things equal, all discernment in place, it's the very thing that a good citizen would do, is offer themselves so that their community can continue to exist. And you would look at the person who flees from a war as actually failing not merely the common good as though it were kind of collective good, but they actually fail even what it is to be human, which is to recognize that the community sometimes calls for great sacrifice. So I hope that gives you some idea, right? And so Aquinas has this immediate metaphysical view and then theological view that sees the role of God as the good from whom all other goods come, but that way that we live, and kind of to distinguish us from lower creatures at least, the way we live our orientation to that common good is through the exercise above all of the virtue of religion in the order of nature, and then also too supernatural religion, and then the theological virtues.
Gregory asks, you mentioned how Humane Vitae might teach a degree of integralism. Could you clarify how? Is this because of the impossibility of truly being neutral towards religions?
Yeah, I mean, basically, what you'd have to do with Humanae Vitae is take the early statements in there that say that nothing is being overturned, and take them at their word, and then also look at what's being said concerning religious liberty and see it only in terms of non-coercion, non-external coercion. Um, that's, I mean, now that's a minimizing interpretation, especially the second half. The document sort of claims that that's the case. Um, and I think something like that has to be enunciated. And Catholic thought always had an idea of the non-coercibility of the act of faith. And so it modifies, or it at least gives a certain context for thinking of some of those 19th and early 20th century claims regarding religious liberty, because it's much more negative before that. But you do have to do a certain minimizing hermeneutic, which is not out of line with the document. Part of the problem is, though, that few did this. Many people think in liberal categories, even conservatives. I've thought this when the bishops 10 years ago got talking about religious liberty, they sounded more like modern political people than even people who were reading Humanae Vitae, to be honest. Yeah.
Brian asks, can appeal to Enlightenment liberalism, at least at the largest levels of society, be instituted to allow space for smaller associations to pursue common good locally?
Yeah, and I've thought about this. So if you notice, I made this comment about like the Aristotelian and the classical model really is so much more small scale. There's a sense in which the bigger levels of the nation state are very thin, good. How to put it? You're more liberal and you're more libertarian the further out you go. I mean, this is something I still have from my own youth as a younger days, I should say, as a libertarian. That basically, the further away that you get from smaller communities, if you're going to have anything you share in common whatsoever, it's a kind of like preservation of the state of commerce, a kind of preservation of the general just nexus of people being able to be free in the broadest sense. One of the issues, the only one of the issues with that is that still tends in a certain direction, because you're gonna promote at that level a kind of set of laws that foster moral neutrality, for example. But I think that, like, in the discussions that are being had, we're never going to be able to give up elements of liberalism that recognize the need for this very point, that dealing with the substantive issues should basically, almost everything that has a bite for anything of substance concerning the meaning of life and human flourishing should just be at a very closer level, because that's precisely where politics is possible. I'm not an anti-liberal guy on the model of someone like Joseph de Maistre, who famously reacts to the French Revolution, but he does make this funny remark in his Considerations of France, where he says something like, the die, if we've rolled the die of history a million times, the one thing that has never come up on it has been the idea of a large republic, because he's mad at the French Republic at the time. But I think there's a certain truth to that. And I think that there are things, Patrick Deneen hints in this direction. There are things from liberalism that we will maintain, because people make fun of the proceduralism of the liberal order, right? It's empty procedure that allows people to do things, but it has no moral character. There are folks like the political commentator like Jonah Goldberg makes this point, actually, and some of the common good people today kind of scoff at him. He's not a bad man, actually. And he makes the point that liberalism does have a moral import, being able to face your aggressor or your accuser, to be able to negotiate in public forum, your rights. Like, these are actually moral goods, and these are examples of things from the liberal order that we could never be kind of rid of, right? History is not merely a tale of just evil. It's kind of rather like evil is like a vampire bat, Maritain says in a number of places, hanging on the side of history. And so there's always this mixture of good and evil, even with the developments here.
Not seeing any other questions here. Some comments. Thank you, Dr. Minard. Gregory says.
Good to talk about it.
Yeah. I thank you so much for coming on and doing this, Dr. Minard. I'm really looking forward to your, like I said, your contribution for the upcoming conference. That is, again, going to be June 11th. I will take all of the contributors combine their videos and stream them all together, probably beginning around 12 p.m. Central. Y'all just stay tuned and look for a notification, probably the day before. At that time, you'll see a notification come up when I will specifically be streaming, but I'm trying to aim for around 12 p.m. Central, but it's gonna vary. But it will be June 11th, which is a Saturday. So y'all stay tuned for that. Dr. Miner, go ahead and put in a plug for anything that you want to make the audience aware of.
Hey, you know what I should do? Hold on. It's out, Michael. It's out. I feel like I'm no longer a liar. The 2 volumes of On Divine Revelation. So if you I guess maybe you haven't gotten your copies. I thought
no.
Okay, we'll have to arrange. I'll have to send an email so that we can maybe do a show. This is 1,500 pages.
Wow.
Apologetic theology. It's kind of although I have one last Garrigou thing technically coming out. I mean, I'm done with Garrigou for a while. And for understandable reasons. And it finally came out. So
I'd like to take a look at that. I imagine he gets into discussions that relate to the magisterium, or
well, there is stuff that's related to the magisterium, but it's mostly about the problem of how reason is open to the reception of faith, although with the distinction between the two. And it's just a tour de force of like all the topics you need to discuss on that boundary right there. Yeah. But it is very good. It's the best of the Thomist treatments of that genre, of the treatise on divine revelation. So yeah, you can get it at St. Paul Center. You can, if you want to buy. I mean, I'll talk to you because luckily you host a show, so we can at least get you a copy. But if you guys are looking for a copy, St. Paul Center has a deal where you can get both copies for cheaper than you could on Amazon. So.
And real quick, there was one more. I'd like to hear your thoughts on classical fascism.
Oh, well, I don't have, formulated thoughts. It depends on what one means about classical fascism. One of the real risks of an overly liberal order is that it's atomizing, and man is not made to be alone. The human person is made to kind of fit into a social group. And so, classical fascism, be it reactions directly to the French Revolution or then the events of the 20th century, are an understandable but wrong. Understandable in the sense of like you can understand how they happened, but they're wrong-headed response to the atomization of individuals that happens through an overly liberal order. Like people will want to be part of a group. I remember, you see, I also listen. I listen ecumenically on the right. So, I listen also to some of the stuff from the Claremont Institute. People get into their little camps and talk negatively about each other. I tend to draw well from them. One of their guys quotes, and it's incongruous for him. It's deeply incongruous for me. A Regina Spektor lyric where I guess it was during 2020 when all the riots happened during COVID, where some lyric says something about, I just went out to be in a crowd to be able to rub shoulders with someone else. Like you find yourself in that sucked up in the mob. Now, whatever that means for Regina Spektor, I don't know, nor do I care. Last time I probably listened to Regina Spektor was whenever I was still at home and my sibling listened to it. But however, that indicates this is this issue of humans when isolated move toward a kind of getting caught in the life that a group has, because there is a kind of social life that exerts itself on individuals, and it's a very dangerous thing. And I think people should take more seriously the need to address the shortcomings of liberalism, lest we fall into a kind of fascistic end, which would be bad, to be very clear. I'm probably too much of a Maritime guy to even think overly positively about Franco's Spain. Many Catholics think positively about that because of the problem of the opposition being communist. I think it was all a very tragic set of events, but I'm not going to weigh in one way or the other there. I'm going to weigh in the negative column, if anything, precisely because fascism is not an answer. It's just an angry outburst that some people think that they can wield against an irreligious and individualistic order, and that's not a good thing. But it's one of these things that the human heart so desires political community and community more broadly, that you can see how people get sucked up into that sort of thing. Yeah.
Excellent. Dr. Miner, once again, thank you so much for your time and your contribution here.
Great. No, great to be back, Michael. Have a good evening.
You too. And everybody, thank y'all for watching. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology. By the way, if you want a course on the magisterium, I am offering one. It's called Understanding the Magisterium. It's at maximusinstitute.com. If you would like to learn more about it, definitely visit that website. See you later. God bless.